Hello, everybody, and welcome to this similarly hastily put together webinar about unpicking the terms of the UK Gambling Act review. My name is Andy McCarran. I'm the MD of Sports Betting Community. We've got together a panel of three very interesting people here who've all been all over this the legislation and how things have been developing, and hopefully we can shed some light onto what is quite an in-depth and full-on consultation that's coming for the review of the Gambling Act. If I can ask you to introduce yourselves. David, if you can go first.
Yep. Hello, everybody. David Clifton here, specialist in gambling law and regulation since the very early 1980s. Director Clifton Davies now, some of you may know, and I also have the pleasure to be licensing expert for SBC News.
Bridget?
Yes, so I'm Bridget Simmons. I'm the chairman of the Betting and Gaming Council, which has only been in existence for a year, but it combines the Remote Gambling Association, Association of British Bookmakers, and the Casino Forum. And prior to that, I was for 10 years chief executive of the British Beer and Pub Association. And prior to that, and worked with David when the Act really first came in, I was chief executive of an organisation called Business and Sport and Leisure.
Excellent. And Adam? Oh, Adam,
hi everybody, I'm Adam Rivers, a director in KPMG's economic. Oh, yep, can you not hear us?
No, it's fine. It's just a little bit of a delay. That's fine.
Yes, I'm Adam Rivers, a director in the economics practice at KPMG. I'm a regulatory economist specializing in betting and gaming. I've worked in the sector for the best part of 10 years and provide strategic advice to clients on a range of regulatory issues, but also commercial issues too.
Fantastic. And as we go through today, you'll see a little Q&A window in the console in front of you. If you've got any questions as we go through, please feel free to type them in. There's a lot to go through. We're going to try and cover as much as we can in 45 minutes. But if there's anything specific you'd like to be answered, drop us a question. So this week was the long-awaited announcement into the review of the Gambling Act. We've been waiting for it for a while, since it was in the Conservative Manifesto 12 months ago. What stood out for you? Were there any surprises? I mean, Bridget, let's go to you first as the industry representative.
I think probably the surprise actually to me was that they made the announcement on national lottery age and the change from 16 to 18 with the announcement of the review. Certainly I hadn't expected that. I think we expected the review to be quite wide and actually welcome the fact that it's quite wide in its remit and what it will look at. And I think actually it's actually quite balanced in the questions it asks. There's lots of work for us and our members to do. But we have a 16-week window for putting in our first set of evidence, and no doubt a lot of discussion to go. But we were very clear we wanted it to be proportionate, balanced, and it to be evidence-led.
What about you, David? What was your first impressions?
Well, like Bridget, I think the fact that there is such an emphasis on the need to ensure that there is robust evidence, that I think that really what we are going to see, I hope, is very much a proportionate, balanced review process. I think that there is room here for there to be a balance in terms of experience of the majority of gamblers, not just the, it has to be said, minority, hugely important though that is, that suffer harm. There is clear opportunity here for there to be a balanced view taken. I think if there was anything in terms of a surprise, it might have been that for those of us who were hoping that the issue of affordability, notwithstanding the Gambling Commission's consultation, the customer interaction consultation, which is really mostly about affordability, despite that having commenced, I think that there was still a hope amongst many and I'll include myself in that this was going to be such a fundamental issue that it would be more properly debated before Parliament. Every indication at the moment is that, this consultation goes ahead and indeed may be determined by the Commission before it actually goes through a proper parliamentary debate. But if there was a surprise, that was a surprise, and possibly the view that's been taken on affiliates, but I'm sure we'll come on to that.
Sure. And what about you, Adam? What was your view when you first saw the announcement?
Yeah, I think it was obvious that the tone in terms of the regulatory change that could come in that's somewhat negative for the industry is focused towards the online side of it. But for me, to try and distill it down, I think it really focuses on two words, equitable and evidence. I think the fear of many, especially on the online side of the review, given what was being called for by certain lobby groups, was that this could come out and suggest there could be a degree of parity between the land-based side of things and the online side of things. And I think there's an important distinction there, whether they meant it in the drafting or not, around really what the word equitable means. And that's regulatory decision-making that's made in a way that is cognizant of the different nature and characteristics of those different parts of the market. I think there's a really big job then for industry, as Bridget and David had said, to then supply the relevant evidence that can be used to support the online industry's views. And questions 1 through 10 are really key in that regard. I think it's also worth noting that it's not really right to consider each of these questions in isolation from one another. And that's a common theme in a lot of calls for evidence processes that you see made in regulatory policy. I think the consensus here is that a UK sector regulator that wants to put the consumer first should be making regulatory decisions that are both sort of fair for consumers overall, and that includes consumers, all of them, not just those that perhaps experience harm. And then, of course, are proportionate. And I think if you go down a route of answering these questions in isolation, you perhaps miss that proportionality angle somewhat. So, the evidence that's going to get given on question 1 around current levels of effectiveness is really vital when you're thinking about the proportionality of questions 2 and 3 on, say, game design and on limits. So I think that's my view overall. In terms of surprises, I'm with David. There's the big elephant in the room of affordability. How do you have an effective consultation like this, given in mid-January you've got to submit stuff on affordability and you're not doing this until the end of March, and by then the landscape may well have changed. And I also am with Bridget. There's a couple of surprises for me on lotteries. I think the decision on lottery duty to keep it as a turnover-based taxation regime as opposed to on profits is interesting, given in the gambling economics literature, it's quite clear that profits-based taxation is less distortive in markets and can enable to raise sort of more tax revenues. And there's also an interesting point about reconsulting on the £1 million top prize for society lotteries. The interesting point there is the timing of it. It's going to be next August, which is after the 4th license competition closes. So bidders in the 4th license are going to be bidding against a landscape where the competition they faced after the bidding process closes may look actually quite fundamentally different. So yeah, those are my views.
Interesting. I mean, obviously the background to all this is as you mentioned, the Gambling Commission already doing work on the affordability regulations and how the industry may have to adapt to those already. But as you all allude to, that has got a chance to completely change the online business as it is without going through all this process in the first place. But Bridget, I mean, evidence is one of the key things here. And as someone who's going to be providing a lot of feedback to government and the DCMS on this thing, is the evidence there already, or do we need to go out there and start creating the evidence? And do we have to collating the evidence, not creating the evidence? And do we have time to bring all that information together?
Well, to be fair, I mean, the BGC and our members have been working on this for some time. It's not as if we didn't all know that there was going to be a review announced. We knew the sort of things that we were going to have a look at. And yes, we're doing a lot of work behind the scenes. I mean, if I could comment on that affordability issue, we've been absolutely clear with the Gambling Commission. This is a very short consultation response. I mean, given that this is Christmas and that we actually have to respond by the 12th of January, I think we believe it should be the responses should be extended by a month, and I think that would be enormously helpful to us all. But I also think that the Gambling Commission appreciate. I mean, there's two sides to this. The first side is that they are a non-departmental public body. They're meant to be independent of government. So having the government telling them what to do is not really how that system should work. But I think they're also conscious that it is a big issue for the review. And what I think we absolutely need here is the voice of the consumer, because it's the voice of the consumer who's going to say, if asked for my bank statements, dare I say it, my tax return, I mean, I wouldn't share my tax return with anyone, and various other information, is that going to mean that I go off to some unregulated market, black market, which doesn't ask me for those sort of questions? I think I was speaking at a seminar with Lord Smith of Hindhead, who actually sat on the Lord's committee himself, and he gave the example, I get £50,000 redundancy, I go to a garage and want to buy a Lamborghini, and no one asks me where the money comes from. If I want to go and do gambling, everyone wants to know where the money's come from. And of course, some of that is right, but affordability to me is about when do we intervene, how do we take action with specific customers? I think we've got to be really careful that we don't make this so difficult that customers just say, I'm sorry, we're not prepared to do that. And the UK is the loser. It's the 3.2 billion that we put into the exchequer every year is at the moment much needed money from the government.
Sure. I mean, there appears to be four or so main pushes for this call to action, specifically talking about problem gambling and the protecting of them, the powers of the Gambling Commission, how it's marketed, and the wider sponsorship question, and when it comes down to the customer, as you say, the potential of an ombudsman, which I think was first raised by Tom Watson. Is it only 12 months ago, 18 months ago? It feels a lot longer ago than that. But was there any more? On the same day, the DCMS responded to the House of Lords Committee report. Was there anything else in that maybe we also need to take into account other than what's just in the call to action? I mean, David, I know you've done a lot on the report into the response to the report from the Lords.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting. Just if I can just make an immediate point on ombudsman. In fact, as far as I'm aware, the first suggestion of an ombudsman came from Walter Merricks, one of the gambling commissioners, at the Raising Standard Conference in 2016. It was put out there, not as an official Gambling Commission line, but certainly as something for consideration. And it died a bit of a death until, as you say, Tom Watson mentioned it himself, and Labour Party ran with it. Here it is, and to be entirely honest, I will not be in the slightest bit surprised if we do actually see an ombudsman. But back to your main question to me, Andy. Yeah, I thought it was very, very helpful, in fact, to have the government response. I mean, I think we all know it's CCMS that's behind the response, but it is labelled the government response to the House of Lords. And I think that does give us some additional clue, certainly as to where they're going to be starting off as part of this review process. Things can change very quickly, we all know that. But the reference to equitable approach is there in the response to the House of Lords. And I suppose in general terms, there were many recommendations in the House of Lords report, Select Committee report, and certain of them quite clearly are going to be included within the debate that's going to take place as part of this review. But there are other aspects in which it's quite clear that what is being said by the Commission isn't necessarily going to be by the House of Lords Committee isn't necessarily going to be run with by the government at least. I think that tying this in now with what we're reading in what's been released so far about the review, The acceptance, and I don't know if this is the first time the government has actually said it in such clear terms, that the more that one tightens the regulation of the sector, the greater the need to ensure that measures are in place in order to prevent the black market from moving in, to quote what it says. I think that that certainly was a point that struck home. Affiliates is another, and I quote, "We have concerns about the potential for a move to licensing affiliates to reduce operator accountability for the actions of their affiliates." Now, we saw responsible affiliates in gambling doing an about turn in their attitude and accepting the principle of licensing of affiliates. Perhaps they may not have needed to do that, but I mean, I thought that was quite a clue being given there. Where else can I take us? The suitability of the current redress arrangements, I mean, that does obviously pick up the Ombudsman point. I think what it also does is tie in very much to what the House of Lords were pushing for, and indeed the PPG, in terms of a duty of care. It's going to be interesting to see how that one develops, because ultimately, if that was to come into force, that would really be a threat hanging over not only operators, but also directors in operators. Would that bring in potential criminal liability? Is there scope, in fact, for, and it's coming on to a different point, but the Gambling Commission's powers, they haven't as yet enforced from a criminal perspective anti-money laundering requirements. It's always been dealt with on a regulatory front. So I wonder to what extent there may be a push in that direction. Underage gambling, interesting. There is scope for parents and guardians to do more, the government says. Well, quite how that gets embodied in any regulatory or legislative requirement, I'm not entirely sure. And also, I think, just final point on this, very interesting comments from the perspective of advertising. And the bottom line, which appears to be the starting point for the government, is that they understand the concerns that exist in relation to gambling advertising, but are pointing to there being a lack of evidence between advertising and problem gambling when one is advertising that is being conducted in accordance with the existing rules. No link between that specifically and problem gambling. So, I mean, there are others, but there's just a few that I think that it's worth reading. I mean, nobody should now think, let's only just concentrate on the review paper. Look at what was said, because there are many other clues in there as well in the response to the House of Lords.
Yeah. We could have had a webinar just on the on the response by the sounds of it. But I mean, Adam, one of the things we're talking about black market there with the acknowledgement that over-regulation can create a black market, and one of the things that we're talking about was not necessarily less regulation, but more powers. I mean, what would the Gambling Commission need to be able to stop the black market growth? I mean, is there any model that they can work from? Is there any record of affecting policing the online black market in any sector? Yeah.
I'm going to be a slightly politician here and actually just jump back one question. So there's a couple of other points in the response to the House of Lords report that I picked up, not in the same way as David, insofar as they show a tone of where the review is going. But I think there's a couple of points which haven't made it into the review itself, which I think are interesting. And then I can come back to the black market point. I think there's a point around metrics that inform consumer choice. So they say that there's going to be consideration on the metrics or range of metrics that would better inform consumer decision making. That doesn't get included in the review, but I think it's actually a really important piece of work and body of evidence when it comes to generating good consumer outcomes. A lot of other regulators have adopted this assessment framework. Can consumers access, then assess, and then act on information in order to make good decisions and therefore avoid bad outcomes? And I think if I were responding to the call for evidence, I'd be making it clear that there are other, say, more behavioural remedies that exist that may mitigate against other more structural remedies that are worth considering. The other point that I'd note is that, and it's within here and it's very strongly made in the House of Lords report, is the role of the financial services sector. They also don't make it in the review in terms of asking for comments as to whether or not they could have a greater role. I guess a point to make about FS is that sort of banks and payment providers, they're typically quite reticent to get involved in social policy unless it's mandated upon them. And they're going to have quite limited incentives to cooperate fully unless there's a strong commercial reason for them to do so, as much as I'm sure we'd all like them to. That typically has been the view in the past. So I think it'll be interesting to see where DCMS come out with that, because I imagine that's the sort of thing that industry is going to be asking for. But just to go back to your actual question on the black market, I mean, in terms of is there an effective model of policing? I mean, there's not a particularly effective one as far as I'm aware. If you look at European jurisdictions which have got more restrictive regimes, places like France, you'll often have channelization rates which are cited as being pretty low, as in the proportion of the black market is still quite high. I think there's a really important point to make there as well about how effective the policing needs to be. So if you take the backdrop of the consultation is that we have significant concerns in society about a very small number of individuals and the harm that they're experiencing. You can translate that type of thinking onto the policing problem. If policing isn't 100% effective, then it's quite likely that it's going to be the individuals that you care about most that get washed up into the black market. And therefore, even if you can say my policing is fairly effective, that's probably not going to be good enough to actually meet the objectives of the policy response. So I think whilst DCMS has sort of positioned it as there being potential mitigants, whether or not those mitigants are going to be fully effective is something that I'd personally query.
Yeah. I mean, is there an argument? I'm not sure if you'd want to deal with this, Bridget, or not. Is there an argument that actually the Gambling Commission has got pretty extensive powers? They're just not using them maybe as effectively as it could be?
Well, I think there's a question there's a question in the whole review about how much resources they have to deal with those sort of things. But I think, as Adam said, this is a really difficult space to police. You've only just got to put into Google now GamStop, and it will come out with 10 different ways that you can avoid signing up to GamStop, which will stop any of your funds or you receiving advertisements or spending money on gambling. The banks, you can all sign up to say you want to stop gambling via your bank, but only if the right code is used. And I haven't met anyone with lived-in experience who hasn't said to me, despite the fact that either, that they haven't gambled for a number of years, that they're still being got at by unregulated sites around the world who find ways of trying to approach them. And I mean, you mentioned France. I mean, Sweden is probably the best example. I think they've got 40% have gone up to 40% have gone to the black market. And I think it was actually a PwC report that was done that showed 200,000 people, or 2% of customers in this country, had used the black market in 2019. So it's how we come out of this being something that, yes. Without doubt, the industry is under the cosh here. We have got to do more. We've done a lot in the last year, but there's definitely more we're going to be asked to do at the end of this. And I'm not under any illusion that this is something that's going to be easy for us to do. But at the end of the day, we've also got to come out with something that says we need to make the customer journey frictionless, because otherwise we will be driving them to this black market. And I think that's really important. I certainly think, I mean, some of the other comments we made, I would certainly be open to an ombudsman. I think there is a gap between what's offered by the Gambling Commission and what, for example, IBAS offers in terms of avoiding bets that might have proved to be problematic. But if you're going to do that, you need to make sure that the terms of reference are absolutely tight. And we've all had examples of ombudsmen that would take forever, and somehow we'd have lost the plot halfway through that. I think duty of care, to me, it doesn't appear as much in the review. I mean, I think there's lots of legal opinion opinion that would say that duty of care probably wasn't appropriate. Susanna Fitzgerald QC actually gave evidence to the Lords Committee on that. So I think that that's there. I think affiliates, I suspect the Gambling Commission said they weren't prepared to licence affiliates. It is a complicated thing. A lot of our members have done a lot of work with their own affiliates, and they've got really tightened up on the rules and how they use them. But again, there's a black market out there of affiliates, which is much more difficult to control.
Andy, can I just pick up on the black market point with just an additional comment? I hope this flushes an opinion on this out from the Gambling Commission, because it's been raised enough times now. It was most recently raised in responses to the HVC consultation, and I've got the Commission's response here in front of me to that. It said, consumer protection is not helped in our view by suppressing standards in the licensed market because of an unsubstantiated risk that consumers will seek out illegal operators. I mean, it does seem a bit blasé on it. It says where unlicensed licensees are identified and found to be targeting British consumers, we will act to ensure they cease these activities. But we're not hearing, I mean, perhaps they are doing it, but I really think they ought to get this message across, because as the BGC has very effectively been doing on behalf of the industry, this is a real fear. One only has to look at the research that was conducted in Sweden and see the staggering figures there. I mean, it clearly is an issue. The online harms bill, we await to see, and I know Bridget and others in the BGC were pushing the government on that in looking to have greater protections in this respect coming out of the online harms bill. So I think this conversation needs to be brought out into the open rather than people having their own views. We need the research. We need to look at what's happened in Sweden, what's happened elsewhere. Why on earth would it not happen here?
Yeah.
I mean, moving on to the biggest push in this has obviously been consumer protection, and one of the strange things that's counterintuitive but still gets brought up is, according to the figures, since 1999 when they did, I think it was the first prevalence study there, the problem gambling rate has more or less remained the same at something like 0.7% of the population, regardless of the rollout of online, the huge amount of opportunities that are now available. The problem gambling rate seems to stayed stable, but there was one phrase in the response that says a stable problem gambling rate does not necessarily indicate a stable quantum of harm. I just wondered how we should interpret that as an industry. Is that something you can handle, Bridget?
I mean, I would absolutely agree with that. One person with a problem is too many. And we need to take a holistic approach to this. So for the last 20 years, the industry has been the sole funders of research, education and treatment. Only very recently has the NHS come in and decided that they're going to set up these centres. I think they've set up 3. There's still £200 million there for them to set up more. But I mean, I visited the one in Leeds, and what was absolutely clear from that is that a lot of the people who have a problem with gambling also have problems in other areas. And this is where it's got to be embedded, if you like, in the NHS, that we help those people. I mean, we spend as an industry, I mean, we've just announced we're going to spend another 100 million by 2024, inordinate amount of time on funding the National Helpline, on funding Gamble Aware, on funding the 10 million that we've just put into education through YGAM and GamCare, and obviously the Department of Education is now involved because it's now a PSHE requirement that you look at something around risk. But it's got to be, it can't be left to just the industry alone. So I hope that some of this will be thought through a little further. And you're right, there's a lot of people coming forward and talking about individual cases here. What we've got to be absolutely careful about is that those individual cases, that those numbers are reducing over a period of time because there's more effective ways of helping them, and that the industry is making sure that we are not preying on vulnerable people. I mean, look what happened in COVID-19. We've just produced a report that said that the number of safer gambling messages from our members during COVID increased by 150%. But we're going to need to keep doing that, and only a period of time will say how effective that messaging has been in making sure that people are more careful about that they're spending within their means, and that it remains, as it does for 30 million people, a fun activity, but not one that drags them into something where they're spending too much or it becomes a real issue for them within their families and friends.
I mean, Adam, how would you interpret the quantum of harm phrasing? Are we going to be seeing a very different approach to different types?
Yeah, it's an interesting. I mean, what the Commission is effectively claiming in this statement, DCMS is claiming in this statement, is that there has been a shift in the tail of the distribution. So they're saying it's remained stable. There's 1% or whatever the figure is, 2% of people that are in this tail, but the amount of harm that they're experiencing may have changed over time. I think the tricky thing with that is that, as far as I'm aware, there hasn't been an academic study yet that is formally able to quantify harm in a meaningful way. I think the Wardle report, which came out in 2018, effectively said that we can define harm in different ways. So we can define it in terms of resources, so financial harm, and indeed time is a resource. Relationships and health, but actually formalizing that into a quantifiable framework is pretty difficult. And just looking at something like player losses is not going to do the trick. So I think it's quite difficult to actually step back and say, is this true or not? Because I think it's something that's currently not possible to test with the frameworks that we've got. But yeah, I mean, I guess when I read it, I just thought interesting that that's being claimed, because I'm not really sure how you measure it.
I mean, with regards to sectors being treated differently, is it fair to say that there was some positive comments for land-based casinos in the call for evidence? Do you think that they look like they're potentially going to be getting a bit of regulatory relief with what they can offer? Do you think that might also spread into the other land-based sectors as well?
I mean, the one that we have pushed very much is very much about casinos. Sorry, David, because this is something that we're really concerned with. I mean, David will be able to tell you what a mess up we managed to make of the 2005 Act. And it was partly, for those of us who remember this, because there was a general election called and everything had to be decided through an agreement at the very last minute. But there were two areas that we're particularly interested in. One is about the number of machines. So you have this business, you can have 20 machines in some casinos and you can have 80 in others, depending on whether you're licensed under a 68 or 2005 Act, or whether it's small, medium or large. And the second is also about checks in higher value casinos. So if you look at the fact that overseas visitors here, in this day and age, still have to use a check is something that we ought to be changing as part of this legislation. I mean, whether there will be changes in other areas, David's already mentioned that they're looking at the society lottery maximum. I don't know, but those are the main changes that we will be looking for, and I think casinos do need a little bit more help, and they have suffered enormously during COVID.
Can I just add to that then? Thanks, Bridget. And yes, we all, well, certainly Bridget and I remember very well what happened as the Budd report came in and the debate then ensued. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that, and there is reference to this in here in the document, so we know it's going to be there on the table. It will include machine entitlements in casinos. It has to include staking limits. What was known by the National Casino Forum prior to BGC was that the reason they didn't get home on those fronts previously is because there was no real evidence in support of the arguments they were putting forward, or at least it needed more evidence. It's not only on that. I mean, it's also on looking at what was really a failure in the new casino experiment. It means that the situation has crystallized in this country. There were only, I think, 7 new casinos that opened. Nobody else could move out of the areas in which they were. There are still bars on some pretty highly populated parts of the country where you can't have a casino at all. That has caused obvious frustrations, and that needs to be looked at again. Another thing that the casino sector has raised, and I think it absolutely has to be pursued, is the fact that you can have a customer walk into a casino with his mobile phone. He can go and sit in the casino, have a drink, and he can gamble online. The casino itself cannot provide any online facility of that nature because it is banned. Now, that to my mind, and I think to the casino sector's mind for a very long time, has been a complete nonsense. And that, I think, ought to be looked at again because, amongst other things, it will give the casino sector an opportunity for innovation and possibly draw in a new, younger market, which it very seriously needs. And so I think that there is every indication in what we've been reading in the last couple of days to have a degree of positivity on that front. And my goodness, is the casino sector and indeed bingo and land-based betting, they are in need of help in view of what has just been happening to them this year. So I hope they get a sympathetic hearing during this review process.
I mean, Adam, do you have a view on that?
I think a point also, I guess only one other point to add is on the reference to cashless payments. And I wonder to what extent that's more of a COVID impact than anything else. It's something that we've been seeing in the States as well. So certain states are now legislating and allowing cashless payments within land-based casino. And it's interesting because effectively people are now less comfortable handling chips and cash. But I think there's some really pro-consumer protection arguments to be made there by the casinos in the response to this particular consultation. I think one concern that gets noted within it is that there is still a degree of anonymity in casinos, and it is harder to monitor players, absent player cards and those sorts of things. But of course, that all gets flipped on its head when you have cashless payments and the ability to track spend. So I think from a player protection perspective, this could also be really beneficial in addition to the commercial upside for the casinos. So a potentially rare sort of win-win in the consultation from that perspective.
I mean, David, you mentioned we've only opened 7 casinos out of the potential 16, I think they were in the 2005 Act. Yeah. I mean, something else that was also in the 2005 Act, which has dropped down, is the ongoing prevalence study. This was meant to underpin the whole legislation and help it adapt to changing societal needs, but then got ditched in 2010 because it cost £250,000 when we were going through a recession, and it's just never really been picked up back to that level. I mean, has there been any mention at all in any of these documents this week?
Not that I've seen in the documents this week, but I mean, I think if one goes back to the 2005 Act and the debate as that came into force, the intention then was it wasn't only just the prevalence studies, it was actually going to be every 3 years, I think it was, that Bud had recommended that there should be a review recognising that there would be technological and other changes happening. And it's not only the prevalence study that didn't happen, those sort of regular reviews didn't happen. We did have in 2012 a DCS committee in-depth report, which you may remember, it was called A Bet Worth Taking, which, as it sounds, made it appear as if there was a benefit from having reformed the law in the way that it took effect in 2007. But there were some very interesting recommendations in that report, which never went anywhere. And that certainly included more regular reviews, and indeed picked up a lot of what I was just talking about in terms of casinos too. So there is a lot more that could be done better, I think, is what is going to come out of this. And I think that will also, and I'm going to bring it back to the Gambling Commission, which has been criticised by 2 parliamentary committees this year in terms of its own evaluation processes. And I think that is something that, if that can be put right by the Commission, and they're working on it, we know that, I think that is going to be of benefit to operators as well. Andy, I'm sorry, I veered right away from your question, but I mean, it's just an illustration of certain of the things that were going to be done that haven't been done.
No, I mean, it just shows you how much detail there is in this. I mean, we're coming up to the end of the session. I want to ask you about the next processing, but first we've got a question in from Rory Anderson at 12bet, who's asking, why is there so much focus on sponsorship around problem gambling when certainly in the Premier League, a lot of the shirt sponsorships are actually not targeting UK players anyway? So if there's concern about UK problem gamblers, why is there so much focus on the sponsorship? I mean, are they just getting wrapped in with the whole wider debate, or is there also we've got to be careful of how we promote gambling to external countries as well? I don't know what the BGC view is.
Yeah. I've done quite a lot of work in this area. In fact, I'm also looking at a sports sponsorship code with our members, which is really important to us. You know, I've asked both the government and the Gambling Commission to look at these whitelisting requirements, because if you look at the Premier League, we have 8 clubs sponsored by betting companies. Only 2 are by members of the BGC. 6 of them, as you say, are by companies who actually have no interest in the UK market, and actually whose licensing seems to come through various other places that are whitelisted. And I do think we need to review it. I mean, the sports sponsorship thing, as someone who's worked in sport for many years, is absolutely passionate about what sport can do for people through life, is that we've got to make sure that money is available for grassroots sport. If you look at 350 million that goes into racing for the industry, 30 to 40 million that goes into other sports, whether it be rugby league, darts, boxing, obviously football, it's really important that money is used in local communities, it's used for education. And I think when at the heart of all those agreements is safer gambling, it's absolutely fine. What I'm concerned about is that everyone has to play by the same rules. And at the end of the day, I'm not convinced we should have sponsors who aren't really interested in the UK market at all. And I think that's one of the things that both the Gambling Commission and the government should look at this. But I would certainly personally be very keen for sports sponsorship to continue, because I think it's really important. And particularly at the moment, sport needs that money.
Thank you,
Andy. Can I just quote what it says in the response to the House of Lords? To date, the government has not seen evidence demonstrating a causative link between exposure to operator logos in this context and problem gambling in children or adults. Nor have we seen evidence that a familiarity with operator logos is linked to problem gambling.
Well, that suggests a certain view on that already, then, doesn't it? But that's interesting. I mean, I've just got one more question.
Just say, Andy, I'm absolutely certain that there will be plenty of people coming up with that evidence. But what we've got to make sure that there is a perception issue, which is why we introduced the whistle-to-whistle ban 5 minutes before and 5 minutes after for television advertising. And we've got to make sure that that perception issue isn't causing a problem. And if it is, then the industry will need to do more.
Just a quick question for, I guess this falls for Adam, really. It's not specifically on this, but it's very topical. What does a no-deal Brexit have? What kind of implications will that have for the UK gambling industry?
Crikey. I mean, look, I think most operators have already got on the track. Yeah. I think most operators are down the track in terms of their preparations. I think, to be honest, the bigger impact on industry is going to be in places like Gibraltar and issues at the border, as opposed to anything else when it comes to colleagues and actually getting them across it in order to work. David, I can see your question on on UK license disputes, it's not something I've put much thought to, but I obviously you know who I am and I know who you are, so I'll get back to you on that one.
Sylvia Altena from Vixio asking the question there. So just to round up, I mean, what would you advise the members of the gambling industry, certainly the ones watching this now who are interested and invested? What do they need to do now? What do they should they be feeding into you, Bridget, or should they be making their own, giving their own bits of evidence to this call to evidence? What should happen now?
I think a bit of both. I mean, obviously, we will be coordinating with our members major responses and pieces of evidence that are needed for this. But what I think is absolutely essential is that we have both the voice of the consumer and that we have the voice of individual companies, and we have the right evidence about how they behave, the economics importance of the industry, and what they're doing to ensure that people are safe. Because there will be a lot of noise behind the background. There will be a lot of evidence given, as there always is in something like this, by people who just don't like gambling, full stop, and want to stop it. And we need to make sure that the voice of those 30 million people who are gambling without having particular problems with it, and for whom it's enjoyable, and they would have the right to take part in these activities. And we need every single company who runs regulated in the UK making their contribution too. So very happy to help. We're obviously 90% of the regulated industry, but we want the right evidence to be there, and we want at the end of the day the government to make the right decisions.
Excellent. And sorry, just to wrap up, I mean, David, what's the process after this call to evidence period?
Well, we know that from the papers we've seen, we know that there will be reflection on what has been said, and we can expect to see a white paper with some proposals next year. No particular indication has been given as to what time next year that is, but it will obviously take some time. This can't be rushed. I think that if I can just pick up on what Bridget was saying, I am anticipating and very much hoping that this time around, unlike last time around before the 2005 Act, there is a much more united industry, it seems to me. And I think that if any particular sector was thinking in terms of fighting its own corner, it would be doing itself a disservice. When I say fighting its own corner, I'm also meaning perhaps criticising other sectors within the industry. That is not going to get the industry anywhere at all. It didn't really help last time round. And I think that what is absolutely needed is a focus on fact and not opinion. It's called a call for evidence. That's what's needed. It's evidence. And we know from those who have been expressing their own views, contrary to those of the industry, that there is one heck of a lot of opinion out there. And we need to ensure that the industry itself is not going to be open to criticism in terms of not focusing on evidence sufficiently itself.
Sure. And Adam, have you got anything to add about where we are now and what should we do next?
I'd wholly echo David's last point there, that there's no excuses now for not providing the robust evidence that's required. And I think if we see another instance of just the industry trying to point score against each other, then the outcome won't be as good as it could be.
Okay, I guess the question there is, and Bridget, are you working closely with BACTA still?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I chair meetings of BACTA, Bingo, of Gambling Business, and of BALPA on a regular basis. And of course, we're talking to them. We want to work with them, and I totally agree with what everyone said. The industry needs to work together for outcomes that we're all happy with and want to support each other. Having, pots at each other in this or any other area, it never gives you the result that you want for any sector.
I think on that note, I want to thank you for making time today and educating the audience as to where we are. So thank you, Bridget. Thank you, David. Thank you, Adam. And thanks, everyone, for watching. And I'll see you at the next one.
Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Andy.